There is a big trend going around on social media platforms, especially, YouTube and Instagram when it comes to photography and YouTubers. And that is filming wide open at f1.2. This is not a good option majority of the time. We're going to be talking about why you shouldn't be doing that, but also the things that you need to consider if you are going to be planning to, film or photograph at f1.2. Now, this is the f1.2 50mm lens by Sony. This is the widest aperture lens they have in the G Master range at the moment. And this is the 7 Artisans Vision Cine lens. This is a T1.05. Now, T-stop is the transmitted light that hits the sensor. The S-stop essentially is the approximate value, which is also correlated with the size of the aperture. And the lens will actually lose a bit of light by the time it gets into the sensor, and that's where the T-stop is the most accurate value when it comes to light transmission. So an f1.2 might actually be maybe a T1.3, T1.4, depends on how much light it actually loses in the elements and diffraction. Now, why does all this matter? Well, filming at f1.2 or photographing at f1.2, the depth of field is extremely shallow. Now, there are a few different things that actually affects depth of field, and that is the focal length of your lens, that is the distance to your subject, the sensor size, and the aperture. Those things will actually affect the depth of field. And one of the biggest issues I see when it comes to Instagram photos, when it comes to videos, is that people will film or photograph at f1.2 and they're really close to the subject, and literally their eyelash is in focus, their eyes aren't in focus, or one eye is in focus and literally the tip of the nose and the other eye is out of focus. This is pretty much lazy storytelling. You don't want the depth of field to be that shallow unless there is a reason for that. Unless you're like, hey, I want you to focus on this one particular thing in the scene, and that would actually make sense. Kind of like this scene in the movie Seven, where Brad Pitt's character is pinned down with a gun from the serial killer. Essentially what they're doing with the focus here is pointing the focus at the gun and heightening the danger of what he's actually experiencing, but not showing who the actual perpetrator actually is, because through the whole film until right at the very end, you don't know who is the actual killer. And in this other David Fincher film, Edward Norton's character here actually looks in a particular direction, and essentially they do a focus pull to the other character, Marla, in the distance. And this effect is actually really successful because of that shallow depth of field. But you want to be able to tell the story without being like, hey, depth of field is going to be literally a bee's dick. But hey, the reason why I got the f1.2 is so I do have that option to photograph or film wide open at f1.2. And if you do want that, there are a few things that you need to consider before you actually do that. Now, autofocus speed. If you have an older camera, or maybe it's just got contrast detection and not phase detection autofocus, this could be a really big issue because it may not even have eye autofocus and be able to find out obviously where the eye is. And having a wide open aperture with a longer focal length, your depth of field will be extremely shallow. And this is where you could go wrong and miss focus on the eye. You could probably hit the nose, you could probably hit the cheek or the eyelash. You won't actually get the eye. Now, you won't notice it as much when it comes to filming because there's so much motion blur, there's so much motion that you don't even know if the eye is 110% in focus. It may just look in focus and that's good enough, and sure, that's perfectly fine. I do it quite a lot. But when it comes to photography, that's where obviously it's one still frame and you're literally focusing on the eye. And if it's not focused on the eye, if it's on the cheek, if it's on the tip of the nose, that's where you're going to be running into issues. And it's one thing that you cannot fix in post-production. Now, in saying that, when it comes to a really shallow depth of field and actually filming, we obviously have to talk about one film in particular, very controversial, Zack Snyder's Army of the Dead. Now, when that pretty much came out on Netflix, I tried to watch it. I think I got maybe halfway through. I just found it really difficult to connect to the characters because the filmmaking brain inside my head was just like, man, there's so many shots out of focus. It really kills me to see that. It just really kills, because you get taken out of the story. And that's just me. That's my own personal experience. Maybe that didn't happen to anyone else. I know my wife didn't have that issue when she was watching it, but I just couldn't watch it anymore because, it was like a mid close-up or a close-up, and they're trying to focus on the eye. And the first AC is struggling. Poor guy, poor girl, whoever it is. Sometimes it was focused on the chin. Sometimes it was focused on the nose. It was focused on the back of the head. It was just, there was too many shots out of focus. And that's, the cons of having a wide open lens. I think they used the Canon 0.95 lens. Like, man, that's crazy fast. And they left it like that. But that's a creative choice. They wanted to make it look, I guess, dreamy in a way. I think that's probably one of the creative reasons why they did that. But you have to understand why you're doing it, and it has to be for a specific purpose, a creative style. Not just like, oh, I've got an f1.2 lens, I'm just going to film at f1.2 because that's what everyone else does. They want that creamy, bokeh. But sometimes it's just not all about that creamy bokeh. You need to try and learn how to tell the story and what depth of field does when it comes to trying to tell that story. Now, another thing is the model or is the subject actually moving? Because if the subject or model is moving and the autofocus can't keep up and the depth of field is super shallow, that's when you're going to have issues once again. You're not going to have the eye in focus. You may actually have a different eye in focus. You may have the nose in focus. The focal point would actually change, and you should actually stop down so you can actually counteract for that focus issue. Now, another thing comes down to shutter speed. If you have a faster shutter speed, essentially that's going to correct a lot of movement from the talent. That's going to correct a lot of movement from yourself. And essentially it's going to freeze that frame and potentially get the eye in focus or your subject in focus. Now, a couple of the key factors that will change these three principles when it comes to autofocus speed, when it comes to moving subject, and when it comes to your shutter speed is distance to the subject and your focal length. Let's say you have the 50mm f1.2, you're 10 meters away. Being 1 meter away will actually have a shallower depth of field, even though your settings and focal length are exactly the same. Now, having that shallower depth of field will obviously increase the chances of being out of focus. Because of autofocus speed of your camera and lens combo, the subject could be moving, or your shutter speed is probably not fast enough to account for that movement. Now, this is the minimum focusing distance on the 50mm f1.2, and you can see how shallow that depth of field actually is. It is very, very small, and this will actually make it very difficult to get things in focus. And this is only about 1.2 meters further back, because I kind of ran out of space in my studio, but you can see the depth of field is actually larger here because we are further away from the subject, yet we are still at f1.2, so still the same aperture, just further back, which increases that depth of field. So this is where you have to consider, okay, if I'm 10 meters away, shooting wide open at f1.2 shouldn't really be an issue. But if you are shooting at the minimum focusing distance, whatever it is, this is where you need to consider to stop down your aperture and film or photograph at 1.8 or 2.2. You need to stop it down so you can increase that depth of field the closer you go, because the closer you get to the subject, it'll decrease that depth of field. So that means you need to stop down the aperture to increase the depth of field to get more in shot. So if you want to utilize f1.2, you need to make sure that you have a really fast autofocus system. You need to make sure that your subject potentially isn't moving. You need to make sure that that shutter speed is high if the subject is moving, so you can freeze the frame faster and obviously get things in focus. You also need to make sure that you're not too close to the subject, because then that depth of field becomes extremely shallow. These things you need to consider if you are going to be filming or photographing f1.2. And the most challenging part of this is that you don't want to finish the shoot, go home, look into the computer, and things are just out of focus. You don't want that. If anything, look through the viewfinder right there on the day and zoom in as much as you can and trying to see if it actually is in focus. Or take the SD card out, Type A card out, whatever the cards it is, put it into your laptop and check right there on the spot. If this is a make or break shoot, you just have to make sure that it is in focus. Or if you want to have a safe bet, stop down the aperture, increase that shutter speed, get a little bit further back, have a little bit more in focus. These things is what you need to consider, and filming or photographing wide open at f1.2 shouldn't be the default. So anyway guys, I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, give it a thumbs up. That would be absolutely amazing. Subscribe to my YouTube channel if you haven't already. The link will be in the description below if you do want to check out my LUTs that I've been using in this video on Joanna as well, and her Instagram will be linked below. But yeah, on that, thanks for watching, and I will see you guys in the next one. All right, let's get it.